Recording in progress.
Well, welcome to Human Design Catalyst, Monday, October 9th, 2023. And I'm here with Michael Steenbeck Litvin and Brian
Graham.
That's right, yeah. And Brian has been coming to HC Catalyst for a month now, 6 weeks.
Yeah,
And you're liking it, right? I mean, you're getting into it.
yeah, I'm really enjoying
Yeah.
design and all its glory.
Yeah, it's exciting for me to well, I meet a lot of people who are getting into human design, but then people who really get into it and who are actually taking notes. And you showed me your notes last week, and it was like pages of awesome. I think it was on the Notes app, or what was it?
Yeah, I just have it saved in a
Yeah.
Google Doc.
But it was really good. Yeah, you had like
yeah.
pages and pages of notes on the channels and gates and centers, and I was like,
Yeah,
I was very impressed.
I'm really enjoying it. I did a couple of the programs through Gene Keys, the activation sequence and the Pearl sequence with Richard Rudd.
And was that recently? Was that a while ago, or?
Yeah, it was probably about 6 months or so before I heard about human design. Before I got here, it's got the same foundational concept.
Yeah, you're still working with the same hexagrams of the I Ching and so on. Yeah. Well, that's cool. How fortuitous that you kind of had a little appetizer before the buffet that is human design.
Yes.
So, great. Yeah. Well, it might just be us. We may have a couple of more folks join on our end, but we can get started. I know that last week we were talking about the centers, and we didn't get to the ego or the G center. So that's going to be kind of the topic today. And so just talking about the centers, whether defined or undefined, and then with encouragement from Lisita, who I see has a beautiful sunrise of Santa Fe as her image. And I see, and also is now waving. Hi, Lisita. Yeah, with your encouragement, we've kind of shied away from the traditional not self strategies of the undefined centers. That's something that can be a bit of the Old Testament human design of shaking the fear of God into people through the not self themes. And we actually had a really good time last week talking about the defined and undefined centers without resorting to characterizing the undefined centers only as not self. We just talked about how they might appear in different ways. Hi there, Ricky. I see you're on as well. And Nancy. Good to see you all. Dave. So yeah, today's topic is the ego and the G center. And it's going to be in sort of a group discussion style like we did last week. So feel free to jump in at any point. Maybe to start with, we could just see who has a defined ego here. Christine, all right, Brian, great, and Ricky. Yeah, so I've learned a lot about, I have an undefined ego, and I've learned a lot of things about the defined ego over my years of study and just experience, because we all have preconceptions when we first hear about something. I have undefined ego, and I hear about the defined ego. I have preconceptions like, oh, defined ego means you have high self-esteem, and things like that, which are not necessarily true, right? What I've learned is that really, anytime you have definition, there's life force energy that causes that definition. And the life force energy we call the channel is just as alive as this little doggo here. What's your dog's name?
This is Anu.
Yeah, Anu, right? And it's just as alive as as an animal. It's that life force energy has to be nurtured and is not something that is static. It's not something that just exists on its own without living, right? It needs to be fed. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be nourished. And it needs to be used and so on. And so much of what human design is doing is showing us the mechanics of how our channels are designed to be used. And if we're using them according to how they're designed, where the sacral channels are designed to operate out of response, or the projected channels are designed to operate through recognition and invitation and how important that is, right? Seeing the channels as life force energy and realizing that you can't really make a prediction of how that channel is going to operate just by looking at the body graph. You have to know that person. We can talk about the design of how that channel is designed to operate, but one person might be getting that recognition, the other might not. One might be waiting to respond for a sacral channel, the other might not, and so on. And so just seeing how this life force energy that defines the ego is really saying the ego needs to be continually nourished, fed, needs to be massaged, needs to be petted, it needs to be appreciated. It needs to be, it's not just going to survive in a vacuum. And that's true for all of the centers, but the ego is one that I really learned a lot by having a partner who has defined ego. I think we just learned so much in our relationships, and having human design is so nice to be able to tell what's you and what's someone else, and where you end and where they begin, and to understand and have a vocabulary and a taxonomy even of some of these concepts. So I've had a number of relationships with people who have defined ego, but there was one in particular where I really got to see how it operates. And she was a graphic designer and artist, and was really good at creating these really amazing, popular. She was doing the gates of the week for human design and so on. And I was, meanwhile, collaborating with her on a project where I was really nagging a lot. I mean, I was kind of on her case about, hey, we said last week this was going to get done. This isn't done yet. Well, if you have defined ego and somebody is criticizing you for not getting something done, they're not showing you appreciation, they're not showing you recognition for what you've done, they're not massaging the ego, they're not saying that, I don't have 44. Okay. 44 knows how to handle egos, right? 44 knows how to massage the big raging ego. Sometimes it's raging ego, other times it's not, but it at least knows how to communicate to the ego. And I have 45 and she was a 21. So that's a very different way of connecting to the ego. That's what Ra called one of the 3 hardest electromagnetics to have with someone else, which of course is subjective, but that was his opinion. And of course, it doesn't have to be. It is not a death sentence to have that electro with people. In fact, the hanging gates need their harmonics. So I love my 21s, but I can tell you, being a 45, that's telling the 21, hey, it's not done yet. We're supposed to be done last week. What's going on here? It's not going to make it go any faster. It's actually going to make it go slower. It's actually going to make them resist and say, no, I'll do it on my own pace. In fact, I was going to do it until you started getting on my case about it. Now I'm going to prove to you how much willpower and stamina I have to resist your influence, Mr. 45, because all you do is just take credit for what I do anyway, right? That's how a lot of times 21s see the 45 as the one who gets the credit, but the 21 does the work. It doesn't have to be that way, of course. And there's an exalted form of that as well. But I got to see really clearly how my criticism in saying, why isn't this done, was actually hurting our interaction and was not at all nourishing to the ego. Meanwhile, she would post these weekly gates on her Instagram. And I guess shout out to the ego, they invented intellectual property. And so I should probably mention the Instagram is everyone is different. So I think any defined ego who happens to they would want that stamp of recognition. But in any case, on the everyone is different Instagram, she was getting 150 hearts and glowing and like getting so much energy from that. I mean, I saw how literally that ego fuel is so different from root fuel, which we call the kind of conventional fuel, or when that sacral motor is humming, or the emotional motor getting all the new experience. It's not charged up by new experience. It's not charged up by responding to something. It's not charged up by the pressure of deadlines. I'm a defined root. That's why I was saying, hey, this deadline's not being met. But no, the ego is what gains energy through being appreciated, being massaged, being recognized. It's like 3 of its 4 channels are projector channels. So, I mean, I'm sure there is a part of it that has to do with the manifestation in the peace. But even that we see in the sort of characterization of the ego. It gains its energy through peace and success. When they successfully put something out to the tribe, as she was doing with her 4426, well, that actually gave her more energy to do more next week. And getting those 150 hearts on Instagram was much stronger currency than any financial reward or any root pressure or anything else. It was, I mean, well, obviously financial reward can also be a form of recognition, especially for tribal channels. But I guess my point is just when we look at the ego center, it's realizing that it is a living, animated, moving, breathing creature. It's a critter that has to be petted and massaged and cared for, and there's no guarantee that, oh, you have defined ego, it means you have high self-esteem. There's no fixed self-esteem. Yeah, you gain self-esteem when you are recognized and appreciated for what you've done, but you also lose self-esteem if you're not getting that recognition, right? It's a mechanical process. It's not something that is fixed. It's not static in that sense. And something I've heard defined egos confide is that they can actually have intensely low self-esteem, that the undefined ego sort of, if you read online forums, tends to claim, tends to try to prove how low their self-esteem is, right? And to amplify and so on that. But the defined ego can actually really have issues when they're not being recognized, they're not being appreciated, nobody's hugging them, nobody's massaging them. It's like they can really intensely feel that nobody cares if they live or die. I mean, this can get to a very serious place of self-worth and of low self-worth. So no assumptions here. Oh, you have a defined ego. That means something, right? We can't assume that. But I got to see really clearly how, right, I mean, at a practical level, if you're working with someone who has defined ego, there is going to be a real value in the appreciation and acts of service and kindness and generosity to them and for them and so on. And it's not just the other way around, that oftentimes the defined ego is the one working for others. Obviously, we have gate 40, which is, look how hard I work for you. This demonstration of love through work and the love of work and loving your work because your work allows you to deliver the goods for people. But it goes the other way too. And the defined ego needs those acts of service and helping them achieve their desires so that they're not simply setting aside their desires all the time for others. So that's something that I've learned as an undefined ego. If anyone else has anything they've learned that they'd like to share. Hi there, Nicola. I see you've joined. Talking about the ego center and the difference between defined and undefined, and sort of sharing, if you have an undefined ego, what you've learned. If you have a defined ego, I guess also what you've learned, maybe what you've learned about yourself. I see Nicola says, it loves to rage. Is that the defined ego, or is that a particular channel? Is that the 21? For some reason, this must have turned off. Sorry, just give us one moment on our end. Oh, okay. Well, sorry about that. Could you repeat? No, that's okay. Sorry.
We didn't hear you, Nicola.
Yeah, I could hear you just fine, Lasita, but I'm still not hearing Nicola, so I'm not sure. Seems to be working. Yeah, you can do well, you know, there's the testing option as well, and we can continue, and then you can just chime in when it works. If you click the little caret symbol next to the microphone, it has audio settings, and in there it'll allow you to test and then make sure it plays back. Yeah, so, but yeah, if anyone, oh, there you go. Yeah, I hear you now.
For some reason, my Yeti's not. Oh, why did it go to mute? Okay. Anyways.
Yeah, these are great. Oh, I know. I've done the same thing when you press this. Yeah, these Yetis are great except for the mute button.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I think a ghost did that or something. Okay. Yes, so I have a defined ego and I love everything that you said. I'm laughing a lot. I have the 4426 channel surrender 4/6 splenic projector. And I have the 26, of course, and the 40. And this year has been, I think other people with defined egos can probably relate to being told that we're too much as kids. And there's a lot of negative conditioning around that. So that's something that I just turned 39, but this year I spent a lot of time working through to actually just allow myself space to show up unabashedly and do things that normally felt too much. And it's really allowed my ego to blossom, if you will. And so when I say it loves to rage, like with a spleen and an ego center defined only, it is an interesting thing just to observe how that plays out, and how sort of subtle the spleen can be in most cases versus the ego that loves to just sort of jostle around and rage and get its way and all of this stuff. Rage, not in a bad way. It's just like party time. It's all happening. Yes, do it. Like it just, for me, it feels very robust and strong. And I love it. I've really enjoyed connecting deeply with it and just letting it be itself, letting it act through me. And yeah, it's been fun.
Well, and being a 4426 single definition projector. Oh, excuse me. Jeez, I don't know what's going on there. I usually have these muted. Apologize for that. But yeah, being a 4426 single definition projector, that's the same as Kanye West. That's his only channel. Yeah, single definition, and that's your only channel, right? That's what you were saying. So yeah, and so I mean, when you have this sort of single definition, it's interesting because before human design, when you have that much openness, you can really, I see the deconditioning process there as one of narrowing down. And there can be, I mean, obviously there's an expansive quality as well for everyone as we learn to grow into certain roles. But it really is a narrowing down process of realizing just how much success you get and how important and crucial it is for your life force energy to be nourished in this very specific way through recognition of what you do for the tribe and really your creative ability for others, what you create for them, what you're able to sell to them or to provide. I mean, it's very entrepreneurial. Yeah, and just how much that brings you success and can make you feel that sense of success compared to, right, undefined sacral. Like you could do so much and work so hard and then not actually feel that glow of success, just feel the transient satisfaction of others that you've been working with or the satisfaction of a job well done, but then it goes away and it's left with kind of this. Yeah, I've noticed I myself have a lot of openness in my chart as well. And it's like how much I did before human design and then how different my life is now, having narrowed down to these areas, but then also in narrowing down, zooming in. And so there is an expansive side of it as well, which is that 4426 is not restrictive. It's something that you can experience. But yeah, just how important it is. I mean, if you're not creating things and being appreciated for that, there's like a withering. There's kind of a withering on the vine that happens. And this life force energy really is life force energy. Like you literally will feel more alive and younger and healthier and all of these things when you are getting recognition for your creative expression, the creative destruction of the 4426. So let's see, I see Ryan, you have the ego defined through the 5125. Yeah, we have a good friend, Mark Germain, who's coming to town in a couple of days, so he'll be here for next week's HD Catalyst. But he is also a 5125, as was Ra. And that's going to be very different because it's individual and it's about being the first to do something. And you would think that that's the creative channel, really, but it's not about being creative. It's, if anything, it's competitive, which is funny because we might assume it's the opposite for the 4426. This sort of capitalistic entrepreneurship seems like that would be where you get competition. It actually reminds me of, there's that saying in business, be first, be cheapest, or be best, right? Isn't that it?
That's pretty good. Yeah.
Something like that, right? So it's like the big three. I bet there's a fourth one also.
Convenient.
Be the hardest working is what I was going to say. And they're the 4 channels of the ego, right? So I don't know exactly, but yeah, you can do some interesting deconstructions just looking at the ego channels and seeing them. They are all very different because, and there's something unique that the ego doesn't have competing channels between the same 2 centers. That is to say, if you look at the root and you look at the 3 channels from the root to the spleen, those are 3 different ways, like we looked at last week, of really sort of to fuel the splenic process of success. Or if we look at the 3 channels from the root to the solar plexus, the 3 different ways of fueling that solar plexus process of feeling and of the emotions and so on. But you look at the ego, it doesn't have that. Each of the 4 channels go to a different center. So they are quite different from each other. And in Steve Rhodes' keynoting, he keynotes the ego as desire. And we have to be careful when we're getting to keynotes. We have to really, I mean, obviously you can be an innocence person with a defined ego, or, there's a lot of complexity there. But it's funny, even when you see that, if we take it literally as this keynoting of the ego as desire, what is it the desire for? Well, when he goes to the G center, it's going to the gate of innocence. So you get into a really funny twist, which is the desire for innocence, or the desire for the purity of love, the desire for integrity, or the desire to stay innocent in some way, to not be corrupted. But I like his keynoting, because when we do kind of think about desire just in the way that we normally would understand, as being full of desire, of kind of wanting more in life, and what do we want? It's different from need, right? It's in a binary with need when we look at the color motivation level. And need is really foundational. We know that the 4th color is actually the foundation in some sense. The 3rd color is also foundational in that it is the center of the colors, so to speak. But that's a kind of a denser topic. But you can just see that you can't really even think about desire until you've had your needs met. But then, if we look at the keynoting of the ego as desire, it's what does the program say is worth desiring? Like the desire to share, to the throat. That's a really beautiful way to look at the 45. Instead of seeing the 45 just as the tribal elder or the sort of tribal leader, we see that it's actually about the desire to share with others. If we think of the throat as how we share with people. And it even is funny to think about it as sharing being one of the collective keynotes, and that's a tribal channel. But there is something about that channel that is saying, hey, we're going to share, we're going to bring this. It's like the throat is kind of the meeting place of everything, the hub where all centers end up. And so even the tribe ultimately says, well, here's what we have to share. Here's what our tribe has to share. And then if you think about what else is worth desiring, the solar plexus, we can desire feeling. We can desire to feel something, to feel connected, to feel part of something bigger than us. We can desire to have traditions and to have feeling evoked through those traditions. Very tribal.
We can desire to enjoy life.
We can desire to enjoy life. Exactly. I want to enjoy my life. This is a very simple thing I've heard 1,000 times, and yet
one of the common channels.
We can see it. Yeah, it's actually mechanically. And how do I enjoy this life? By being a part of something bigger than me. And then, it's worth desiring the G center, desiring really the higher love and the higher self, the higher spirit. And it's worth desiring success through the spleen, and health and material. It's like there's that. Yeah, it's like it's worth. I want to be healthy. I want to have better habits of health in that sense, and things like that. So just one of the ways of looking at the channels. I mean, it's from a different perspective, I guess. But yeah, if there's any comments, any comments on the keynoting of the channels, obviously that's kind of an unconventional approach to them. But
The business ones were good. B first, obviously 15,125. Being cheapest would be 44.26.
Yeah, I've tried to create a way to be a bit more efficient. Yeah.
The best would be 21.45.
Absolutely.
And then we had different fourth ones. What was yours?
I said to work the hardest.
Work the hardest. That's interesting. But the heart doesn't connect to the sacral, because if it did, we'd live forever, right?
that is an interesting obscure point that Ra talked about. That the incarnative process can only happen because the heart and the sacral aren't.
Well, my first thought before I strung all these business keynotes to the channels, my first thought was still most convenient as something distinct from cheapest. And I do think that could be 3740 to be the most convenient.
I just think of 40 as the love gate of the ego. That's the love of working hard. But I mean, it is.
Yeah.
That's why I was thinking that. And also convenient might also be 4426, because when you think of the new and improved creativity of it's all about how do we create something better. So it's kind of like, so even that could also be the best in some sense. It's hard to say.
But there's something pretty like DoorDash about 3740 too, you know.
Well, there is an economy of scale, maybe, that when you're a part of something bigger than you and you're all supporting each other in something bigger than you. I mean, it's communism versus capitalism, right?
Yeah,
if you look at the channels in terms of their political leanings, you're going to see left liberalism and communism, Marxism, socialism. Is socialism considered the same as communism in the keynoting?
Yeah, there's no special separate
but that would be 3740. And that side of it, and then when we look at capitalism, that's more 4426, the free market. And it's interesting too that if you think of the spleen as more conservative and the solar plexus as less conservative, more progressive in that sense, that capitalism is the more conservative of the two, despite its kind of ways of painting itself as so cutting edge. It's like the older model is the one that says everybody compete in the free market. And the more recent model is the one that says, let's all work together somehow in a way that is universal. Yeah.
And that's a paradox familiar to us from human design, that it's old fashioned to think of the future and futuristic to think of the past, right? Because of the spleen is what we came from, and the solar plexus is what we're going towards, what we're evolving towards.
Right. That's so funny. In that the solar plexus is how we think of the past and reflect on the past. And the spleen is how we make predictions towards the future, because it's associated with the logical circuitry and the survival that is future looking, because it's trying to make predictions of how much food we need for wintertime and things like that.
Right.
So that's I've never actually thought of that.
You've said it before.
Well, okay. I've never thought of it the way that the 6124 is formulated here. But yeah, I mean, it is backwards in that sense, in that it's not like we came from a form that was very past oriented and we've evolved towards a form that's very future oriented. It's actually the opposite. We're evolving towards a form that can understand its past through the reflective capacity of the solar plexus, and as an awareness center, as a burgeoning awareness center, to abstract feelings out of the past and to create these abstractions, these narratives that tell a story about how we ended up here. That is what we're developing. Yeah, is more the capacity to understand, not even understand, I guess, because understanding circuitry is more logical, but to have a compelling story. Well, I really enjoyed something Dave shared. Dave shared this wonderful snippet of Ra talking about and this was just personally, he just sent it to me on messages, but it was a snippet of Ra talking about the voices of the throat. And there are 11 throat gates, so there are all these voices, but what Ra was really saying was that you could actually see the left and the right side of the throat. And it's something interesting. It's like people ask, well, how come there's a twist in the circuitry? When you're studying the circuitry coming from the head, you have the logic and then it kind of zigzags over. Same when you're coming from the root. Right. The logical side is one side and then it kind of twists over so that it's on the left. Well, the left is the splenic side, right? Except for the head and the root. But the left being the splenic side has to do with, like you were saying, with the past, with survival, with the spleen. And then the right being the solar plexus side has to do with feeling and with the abstract circuitry and so on. And so you can actually look at these voices of the throat, and the way Ra was deconstructing it was saying, this solves a great mystery of communication, which is the two fundamental ways you can communicate. One is the pattern-based, logic-based small talk that says, hello, how are you? Have a nice day. All the formulas that people have. And these formulas, which we know are logical, are there to ensure the good health of the social interaction.
Oh, yeah.
So it's on the healthy, and they're made to make you feel good. And he was talking about how 731 alphas like yourself, it's all about making everyone feel good. These politicians that say, we're doing a great job and we have enough food for the winter and we're going to be fine. And all of this sort of splenic side of feel good. They're pumping out feel good to people. But it's not the role of the spleen to confront the truth. It's just to feel good. It's to enforce a pattern that is a formula that you can repeat in order to feel good. And then on the solar plexus side, you have, well, the honesty, right? You ask a solar plexus person or someone who has more solar plexus gates. I have gates on the solar plexus side. I have gate 12 and gate 45. And you ask me, hey, how's it going? Oh, not great. I'll tell you, it's been a really rough day. Well, hey, they weren't expecting, it's like, hey, I'm just expecting this formula. You say, it's fine. Everything's fine, right? That's the formula. That's the answer. It's the splenic formula that keeps the feeling good. So that's another interesting sense that it's like we have to understand feeling as feeling towards truth in some sense, because the way we use feeling ambiguously to describe all feeling, well, we know that the spleen is the center of feel good. That's feeling too. It's just not necessarily the confrontation of truth. It's maintaining a surface level feeling.
Sometimes I say feeling well versus feeling good, that the spleen is feeling well.
I see. Yeah.
You just feel good enough. But because enjoyment and savoring or whatever is all solar plexus.
Yeah, you're not savoring that nice day. It's like, if you really are, that is on the solar plexus, and then it really is a nice day. It's not just every day. You're not just savoring every single moment of every day. But the spleen is sort of carpet bombing with its feel good of, everything's good, everything's fine, it's all good. So that was interesting though. And there's more to that quote as well. It was very, very beautiful deconstruction from Ra of how people talk out of both sides of their mouth, so to speak, and that there are these two distinct halves to human communication with very different purposes.
Mike, I was going to send it to you as well. I actually reached out and asked you where you would want me to share something with you, but the conversation didn't really take off. I'm not sure where to communicate with you, but I was going to send it to you because did you send me a text?
Yeah, you gave me your number. I sent you a text.
Oh, really?
I hope so. Maybe I got the number wrong.
Oh, very recently.
Yeah.
Today. Okay, cool. Hi.
Hi.
Never mind. Anyways, yeah, I was gonna send it because I was sending it because I brought it up when you guys were talking about some other thing, and I was like, can't even remember what it was, but I ended up bringing that up as because we were talking about. I don't even remember what it was, but I was like, well, don't forget, there's also this sort of throat thing. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I brought it up and I thought I was going to share
it. Was last week, wasn't it? When we were talking about the throat. Yeah, no, it was just an HD Pulse last week. You were saying what an incredible snippet from Ra, and it is, because it is something, it just shows that there are so many ways of understanding human design and understanding the body graph and the wheel and all of it, and that you can just keep extrapolating new understandings in a really profound way. I mean, even just explaining these very fundamental things like, where does small talk come from? Right? Well, small talk is very splenic. Right now we're in gate 57. We're on the cross of penetration, which is all about the surface. It's all about small talk. See, we're joined by Vaughn, who loathes small talk.
Human design saved my life.
Wow.
I'm so happy I discovered human design.
Damn, that's
now that I know who I am, I can act accordingly.
Okay.
I'm overwhelmed.
Okay, well, that's what
Another
his-
success story.
his- Vaughn is a very sarcastic person, but the fact is, if you hang out with enough human design people, you're going to start to get things from it. He actually, you did say something earlier, Vaughn, which is that anytime you initiate by offering something, everyone says no. But if you just wait for them to ask for it, it actually works. And as a
I'm gonna wait for them to beg for it.
he's going to wait for them to beg for it. He says, yeah, well, but it's true. I mean, Vaughn literally got to witness how day after day after day, as a manifesting generator, really a generator with manifesting potential, every time he would initiate offering something, people would say no. And yet, if he moves to a table, they all move to sit by that him, and they want his chair. Or if he doesn't, if he has something and doesn't offer, people come and say, "Can I have that? Oh, what's that?" And they get so interested. And so it's really just these fundamental energetic laws where if you're a generator or a manifesting generator and you're initiating by offering people, they're going to tell you no. You're going to meet a lot of no in your life, which kind of wears you down over time. That's the resistance that we talk about. So. Well, I just love that that raw snippet about the voices of the throat. I mean, that to me is just such a great piece of the puzzle. And like any of these things we learn, we can't take it too far. We can't turn it into too much of a rule. I guess the logically inclined among us are always going to try to turn it into a formula, and then something's going to be the exception to the rule. Although I've heard people also get confused about it. The abstract side tends to believe there is no such thing as a formula. So the more abstract will then say, well, there's an exception to every rule. Well, yeah, but there's also the saying in logic, which is the exception proves the rule, because the rule is the majority of the time and the exception is what doesn't fit the rule. So it's not that the exception invalidates the rule, the exception actually demonstrates the rule because the rule applies to what is not the exception. So anyway, this is just from somebody with 952 format channel. Obviously, the logic is accurate enough, but we should also realize it's only about 80% of the time, and then the other 20%, is not going to be. But anyway, I don't know if you have any more comments, Dave, or anyone. I see there's a comment from Nancy back on the ego center, but I just love that point about the throat gates. That was so profound. And then Dave, you have 1222 and 3536. I don't know if you have any throat gates on the splenic side, or are you?
I don't. Those are my only throat gates.
So you're just the voice of truth, just like me. We're the voices of.
Nice.
Whereas Mike is our, elected official, our recognized, elected politician who is here to tell us the good and maybe, find a way to present the bad news in a way that's palatable. So, because part of 731 is saying, look, we might not have enough food, but it's okay. We're going to be fine because we have a plan. There's always a plan. There's always a logical prediction that we can make. Like if we keep going, we're not going to have enough food to make it through the winter, but we have a plan. If we ration the food, we're going to make it. It'll be fine. So it's sort of the good news bringer. Whereas that solar plexus side is more of the, how's it going? Terrible. Well, that's not what you're supposed to say in polite society. Yeah. Well, I see a comment from Nancy. Learning from her undefined ego. What her mind thinks her life needs is far less than what her body wants. Simplicity gives her spaces to breathe in openness. Yeah, that is a great bit of wisdom that I think the undefined ego can really be in a great position to kind of observe how the mind can fill in that ego of this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what my life should be, and so on. It's because, if you're living out the life force, then you're not here to observe it and go to school there. You're here to experience it. I mean, sure, you might observe your own life force energy, but you're really here to experience it, to be it in some sense. But yeah, so she says, what her mind thinks her life needs is far less than what her body wants. Simplicity gives her spaces to breathe in openness. She's also learned not to possess something is liberating without ownership. So yeah, it can actually be really liberating. Vaughn is an undefined ego who possesses all of his possessions are on his person right now. And he has lived that way for many, many years. I don't even want to guess how many years he's lived that way, but pretty much the whole time, I would imagine. And that the liberation from ownership is something that can be very comfortable. Yeah.
Actually, you also have lived your life right now. You literally don't have anything you own because nothing belongs to you.
Okay, Vaughn is now saying that I also, and presumably we also have lived our life that way because nothing belongs to us. And that is some undefined ego wisdom. That not only is he living
And
without
freedom's just another word for nothing else to lose.
That's a good one. I like that. Continuing with Nancy's comment here, that with her undefined ego, she has learned the vanity of worthiness by giving. Yeah, that people have such vanity of, by being such a giver, they take such pride in their giving and they become so vain. I've given so much. And addiction to self-sacrifice by not being open to receiving is the most stupid form of self-torturing. Yeah, to really be able to receive is not easy, I think, even for a defined ego, but for an undefined ego, we have to learn each of these things. We have to learn how to give, learn how to receive. There's so many phases that the undefined centers go through. Not to say that they're more complex than the defined centers, but it's about education and it's about a change in awareness. And so it's like those memes where it's like the big brain meme where the person is having perpetually greater and greater stages of their awakening process, where with the undefined ego, you might first learn, wow, I don't have to give compliments. But then later you learn, I can actually learn how to give a compliment. And you might learn, I don't need compliments from others. Then later you learn, wow, I can actually learn how to receive a compliment in a way, right? And so it's like learning how to do these things that others take for granted, that they might just automatically have a mechanism that will do that. But learning how to actually give a sincere compliment and learning how to receive a sincere compliment and learning how to actually gain energy from that. Because, defined or not, we all have an ego. We all have a part of ourselves. We call it the heart, really. And this heart center, it's important. And so there can be a phase of the deconditioning process of realizing that something's not important when previously you would put so much import into it. But then there's a recovery of its importance later down the road, a sort of newfound appreciation for it. So it's like before human design, a lot of people with undefined ego might be self-sacrificing and giving all the time just to prove their self-worth and so on. And then they decondition and go, wow, I don't have to give. And I don't have to do all this. But then later they actually learn how to genuinely give in a new way, in a different way than they had before, a way that is according to their response, if they're a generator, or according to other strategies. So yeah, I really like that. The vanity of worthiness by giving and addiction to self-sacrifice by not being open to receiving is the most stupid form of self-torturing. And then finally, she writes, not knowing what to want is okay. And little satisfaction in outcome is normal. Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, not knowing what to want, that is okay. That is part of the learning process, is learning what is reasonable and unreasonable when you don't have an innate compass to tell you what seems reasonable to you. Something that Ross said, which is I've repeated this and I've gotten a little flack for it. A few people have told me, well, yeah, maybe he said that, but that doesn't mean, Ross says lots of things, right? So I've had other human design practitioners kind of say, well, that might have been something Ross said once and never returned to, and you can kind of dismiss that, but I don't think so. He said that the ego is the center of reason, that all reason comes from the ego, not from the ajna. And that makes so much sense to me. The reasonableness, like be reasonable. When you're weighing a soul against a feather, right? It's the ego, it's the heart that weighs the soul against the feather. It's not the Ajna center. So yeah, I really like that. This idea that the defined ego can be reasonable or unreasonable, or it can change and be more or less reasonable at different times, but it's the undefined ego that's here to witness and become aware of the other defined ego people, and to see for themselves, to sample the different, oh, you've said this is reasonable. I grew up being conditioned this is reasonable. Now there's a different defined ego, and they have a totally different set of what's reasonable and what's unreasonable, and realizing how conditioned I can be to think, it's unreasonable to imagine I could be that successful, or it's unreasonable to imagine I could have this kind of life. It's unreasonable to think I could get the things I really want. And then you meet somebody else for who those things are perfectly reasonable, and it changes your entire perspective, because the undefined ego can be so conditioned into what's reasonable or not. Oh, don't ask for that. That's unreasonable. You should never expect that. You should never reach for that. So, yeah. Well, this is a good place to go to the G center, I think, because especially when we're talking about expectations, the G center as the sort of spiritual heart. I mean, the ego center is already kind of a metaphysical heart, but it has more connection to physicality on account of its tribal nature. No tribal channels reach the G center. Something interesting about the G center.
The self as a social unit, having stock, having clout.
You're saying that's the ego, right? But then the G center is the self as a spiritual unit in some sense.
Right. Well, is there even a unit there? You know, there's not an extent in the same way.
That's, yeah. And the G center being our navigational mechanism, the home of the magnetic monopole, the seat of the magnetic monopole, that is how we navigate, and being related to, well, it's the center of the spirit. But when we think about what the spirit really is, on the one hand, it is something to do with our identity, and it's also with our sense of place. And we realize that identity is linked to place, like those animals that only recognize their mate in their territory, and in a different territory they don't, right? Or the connection between the territory, the property of the person and the properties of the person. To get a little Deleuzian, there's a great Deleuze level of analysis where he looks at the properties in the sense the French writer Michaud would look at properties, my possessions, what I own, what I possess, my properties, but then also the properties of me, the properties of who I am. And this does get into sort of the conflation between the ego and the G center, and how we have to disentangle them, and how the possessiveness of the ego versus the properties of the spirit. But I do think, even though you're saying that the ego is more of the social unit, the clout, the standing, the status, the G center, we can compare it, because we do have collective channels there. And what we can compare is the spirit, and who has a hospitable spirit or an inhospitable spirit, who's generous and not generous. Like in a debate in philosophy, there's a saying, it's mostly in from the tradition of analytic philosophy, which is to be charitable in an argument with the other, which is not to assume the worst implication of what they're saying, or not to infer negative assumptions on their part, but to be charitable in your reading of another, to be charitable of your interpretation of another. And that is in the spirit, that the spirit of charity, right? It's different than the ego, which can give, but this is a different thing. This is more the generosity of spirit. This is something that you can't see in the chart. It's not like one gate is generous and one isn't.
The G center doesn't really invest. Spirit doesn't really invest. Spirit accommodates, and it allows, and it holds space maybe, or creates space in some way. But there's no desire in the spirit. What the spirit has is, I don't know, it's beyond desire. It's like some sort of a vital trajectory.
It's transpersonal love, which also is direction. I mean, there's 4 love gates and there's 4 direction gates in the G center. the 4 love gates of the cross of the vessel of love and the 4 direction gates of the Sphinx. And yet love is direction and direction is love. Or to quote Charles Sanders Peirce, you may know him, spelled as Pierce. People often say Pierce, but it's pronounced Peirce. Charles Peirce said, love is metaphysical gravity.
Cool.
And that's one of the best formulas of love that I've heard.
That's great.
Where
Makes a
our
lot of
magnetic
sense,
monopole draws us to others and to certain places where it's so interesting to see our decision making, even though we have different mechanisms for decision making, and I make decisions sacrally, and you know, people make decisions splenically or through emotional clarity or from the ego and so on. And obviously there are self-projected projectors who for whom the G center is their decision-making center. Nevertheless, it's kind of an inner authority for all of us behind the inner authority of the body graph, in the sense that the body graph is helping us to navigate the correct direction for our magnetic monopole, for our form, whether you have a defined or an undefined G center, in that the decisions we make take us to different places. If you enter into human design as a vegetarian and your inner authority leads you to eat meat, and you're going to the butcher, you meet a different kind of person that goes to the butcher with a different spirit, you know, or vice versa. And that the decisions we make are taking us to different places where we meet different people. So there's a real mystery of people and place and of chance encounters and all of this contained within the G center. In fact, my G center channel and my personality sun gate 46, part of 2946, that channel itself is about being at the right place at the right time, and what might be seen as serendipity that is really the outcome of great preparation and hard work, but it can be seen as pure serendipity. But I mean, there are these great coincidences where I ran into somebody in New York at an art opening, and then 3 hours later ran into them completely across town on a subway. And it's like, that doesn't happen, except that it does. And that is what that is part of the mystery of the G center, is how it will take us to these places where we will continue to meet somebody, or you kind of get the sense of no choice from that as well. That is one of the interpretations of no choice, is that, well, you end up running into them anyway.
Yeah, the temple, the body, sort of being able to affirm life through the preparation, the invisible preparation of outfitting the vehicle with what it needs to produce the chemistry that it needs to be able to access the spirit, so that it can exercise the spirit without straining it, to say yes to something that puts you on that subway meeting that person at the right time, because you weren't assuming the worst about what would happen if you went there or hung out with this person or whatever. You're doing all the work of making sure that you're at an equilibrium so that you can affirm the things you're supposed to affirm.
Yeah, I see so much of, and we both have defined G, so we're not necessarily here to learn about it in that sense, but I do see so much of my understanding of the G center as having changed from, in the beginning, seeing it in a very superficial way, or even in a way of just taking the concepts as sort of hollow concepts, love, direction, identity, and now seeing it in such a, in some ways, even more concrete or literal sense of the actual lived life of the person, and whether they are always greedy for more, or and myself included. I'm not just saying that the undefined G will be greedy. I see the undefined G as having to learn so much more, because a lot of undefined Gs can be so wrapped up and conditioned in what they're told life should be like and what expectations they should have. It's kind of like a defined ajna person telling an undefined ajna, think for yourself. You know, that's actually the worst advice. What we're meant to do is to sample all of the other thinkers who've thought for themselves, and then come to our conclusions out of that wisdom. But similarly, I wouldn't tell an undefined G, find your own way, find your own path. I would say, sample all of the other paths. Like if you were a filmmaker and you have an undefined G, I wouldn't just say, find your own voice, find your own direction. I would say, sample the directions others have done, and then compare them and contrast them, and see what you like about this direction, what you like about that direction, and not totalizing any one of them, because I am here to say this is the best, that I found the best way. I found the best way to, it's the best way to drive. It's the best way to make eggs. It's the best way to fill in the blanks, right? Every defined G has their best way that they think is the best.
It's my way, ain't it?
It's my way. It's my way, and it's the best way. And that is what we're here to do, is to sort of gamble with best. It's like kind of like they're both gambling, and there is something related to the spirit in gambling, by the way. And it makes me really sad to see actual gambling, by the way. That is something that I find very demoralizing to the spirit. But there is a sort of a spiritual gambling where the defined G is saying, all right, I'm calling it. This is the best it gets. And this is the right way to do it. And I'm going to just stay committed to this person. Doesn't matter what happens. I'm staying committed. Doesn't matter. This is where I live now. I live here and I'm settled, and the undefined G is kind of always keeping one eye open. Well, yeah, I'm in this relationship, but am I really meant to be in this relationship? Yeah, I'm living here, but am I really meant to be here? This is my vocation, but is that really my vocation? Maybe my vocation is something else. And so there's this continual, I would consider, self-sabotage by never fully committing to anything to actually allow it to elaborate by continually changing. Now, at the same time, that is the education of the spirit, realizing when that change was needed, because the opposite can happen too. They can get so stuck in something and lose the imagination that there could be anything else out there. So I see it as the education of the spirit, where the undefined G is here to sample and learn and ultimately come to its own wisdom and realizations of, actually, that was pretty good, wasn't it? Actually, I was being greedy because I'd already, there's that great Hoja joke where he's asleep and he's getting gold coins, 1 gold coin, 2 gold coins. He gets to 9. He says, give me just 1 more. And he opens his eyes, his hand's empty. And then he says, okay, I'll take 9. It's fine, but that's the undefined G. It's continually wanting that extra gold coin in its foolishness. In its wisdom, it can actually see what coins are gold and what coins are just painted. Right, there's painted copper.
It can see too many ways and it forgets which ways it likes.
Well, but in its wisdom, it can see which ways are true gold and which ways are fake gold, fool's gold. And it can actually become very discerning in that, more than a defined G like us. I mean, we just have our way, but we can actually learn a lot from the undefined G, who says, actually, there's another way you might like. And then we say, no, this is our way. But no, I'm joking. We're actually always collecting ways. And even when I say that the defined G has a way, I mean, it has a way right now. We're always open to a better way. It's just that the defined G is continually looking for the best, but it's using its own internal navigational mechanism to say, this is good enough. Whereas the undefined G is looking for the best, but it's not turning to the defined G in its life, at least not in the beginning. It's saying, I'm going to find the best way on my own. I'm not going to listen to what anybody else says. And then I'm going to go find my own best way. And so I think the wisdom is to realize that they're not meant to be independent in that way, that we have built-in interdependence. And it's very humbling to realize our undefined centers are kind of forced interdependence. And we can either be interdependent kicking and screaming, or we can be interdependent willingly and actually with honor, so to speak.
And that's one of the centers that is statistically 50-50, defined and undefined.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, like the solar plex.
Like that,
I didn't realize that. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, well, that was my defined G Sermon on the Mount for tonight. But if anyone has any comments, any of the there's a question from Nancy for the defined G. How consistent is love for the defined G? Could you be certain of truth in love or certain of relationship? And there's 2 questions. So that's the first one. Very consistent. In fact, I say that for a defined G, if you've loved someone, you always loved them from the beginning, and you always will love them, and it never, ever, ever changes. And I remember being shocked when I kind of thought of the undefined G as someone who could actually love anyone, theoretically. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's kind of a scary idea for me. But yeah, I mean, if I loved something when I was 12, I still love it. I might not express my love for that all the time, but it never really changes. Which also kind of reminds me of the comment that love is instantaneous, but trust takes time. And so loving something can happen spontaneously, instantaneously, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should be with that person or that you should make certain decisions based on that.
And trust is ego and investment.
There's a trust in the G center too, though. The trust in the good
faith.
luck coming around. Yeah,
Faith and grace. Yeah.
Yeah, like the trust in that good things will happen down the line. Yeah.
But if the undefined G, so if when they're looking for their way, there are some ways that are relevant to them and some that aren't. You'd think it would be the same with people. So the trouble is they can relate to any way. So I don't know if they can fall in love with any person, but they could see how they could, I mean, because to me, those rules are inconsistent. It would be one or the other, because the way that you describe the way is different than this falling in love with somebody.
But I also see as a defined G how I could fall in love with anyone, any undefined G, because they could be sculpted and molded into what is lovable, right?
But they have a monopole and they have a line of geometry still.
Yeah.
What is inconsistent is their means of relating to it. Their inconsistent access to the sense of its continuity.
Yeah, and we all have a spirit. What is different is that some of us have our spirit heavily protected by a life force energy that continually creates like a shield around that spirit that can be, someone can injure it, but it can also be very resilient because the life force energy is pumping into the healing mechanism, the self-healing mechanism that ignores that injury and perseveres. And so for me as a defined G, I love when somebody aims criticism of the HDHD conference or something that I'm involved in with undefined Gs at me, because I'm here to take that arrow, because it doesn't lead to me having an existential crisis of questioning myself of whether I should be doing it or not. Whereas when I have undefined G people I'm working with, and last year, and I guess not last year now because we're past 2023, but the 2022 HDHD conference, I did collaborate heavily with an undefined G person. And I was so glad that any criticisms of the conference weren't directed at her, because she would take them more seriously in that sense as, should I go a different direction? Does this mean that my direction is not correct? My direction is being criticized. So you're absolutely right. We all have our trajectories, but the undefined G is so susceptible to conditioning and to outside interference and influence from others telling them their direction is wrong and making them actually question their direction. Whereas I have such a self-confidence or certainty in my love and direction that I can persevere through a lot of slings and arrows. It takes a lot to get me to question whether it's the wrong direction. I can remain convinced it's the right relationship, even if everyone's telling me it's the wrong one and things like that.
They have their way or their ways, and they have their person or their persons, and they have the things that they like. It's not only that it's borrowed, it's just harder to differentiate what is theirs and not.
And because what it really is about is the wisdom to be in the right place with the right people who have the right spirit that's the healthiest for them and appropriate for them. It's the interdependence again. And when you're in a relationship as a defined G with someone who has undefined G, and they go back to visit childhood friends, and all those friends are getting married and having kids, and they're all saying, you shouldn't be with that person. That affects them so strongly. A week of that conditioning, even if their friends don't say it verbally, just being in those auras that are going in such a different direction in life, they'll break up with you. And as a defined G, you have to just hang out for a week and say, okay, well, I'll keep the fire burning. I'm not going to let you break up with me, tell me that it's the wrong direction. I still think we should be together. And I'll just continue thinking we should be together until enough time has passed that it's clear that we can't, if that's the way it ends up. But you can see how just knowing these simple things can help at a practical level so much in relationships, because otherwise the defined G person can flip out and say, oh, you're breaking up with me. Fine, I'll break up with you now and whatever. And that's not what they're here to do. They're actually here to persevere through that chaos and to realize that ultimately it's the wisdom of the undefined G to determine who makes them feel comfortable and who actually allows their spirit to elaborate itself in a healthy way and to cultivate a healthy spirit and not a greedy spirit and not a spirit that's constantly setting high, impossible expectations even and impossible ideals.
To acquire the correct attributes. On a mundane level, I think it's funny because it just sounds fake to me having defined G, but undefined G people have to remember who they like. They have to remember who they would rather hang out with. It's not obvious to them.
Yeah.
They're willing to hang out with friends they prefer less just because that is who happens to contact them or whatever.
Yeah, it's right. It sounds fake to you because you have a defined G, so
I
you
know,
can't
I get it,
imagine.
yeah.
You can't imagine that.
I
but-
forget. I don't even like hanging out with this person. Like what? Like it's not obvious to you. Like
Well,
2
if you
seconds?
drink enough alcohol, you'll forget that, because alcohol, of course, weakens the liver and the G center, which is
The first drink
are
kicks the
related.
G awake.
I see. Okay. Okay. Fine. Oh, there's one more question from Nancy, and then we have a comment from Ricky Rebel. The question from Nancy: what's the experience of the defined G in penta? And I'm just going to comment that even if you're a so-called penta person like Mike and myself are, if you have a defined G through a penta channel, you have a defined G, but not through a penta channel, Brian. But either way, I don't necessarily think that makes us have some special experience in penta where, oh, we feel so. I mean, to me, it's that the penta is going to borrow, and what a penta is, by the way, is a group of people. Like we're in a penta right now. The penta is going to borrow the channels it needs to compete with other pentas on the material plane. So you put people together, like for our human design trivia night, and those pentas are going to operate to try to compete to win out on the limited resources. It's like Family Feud. That's what they're going to do. It's not necessarily giving us some special experience of, oh my, I feel so good because I'm in this penta. Like, I don't know. There's a discussion of you only feel recognized as a projector if you have one of the 3 G center to throat channels. That's something Brayton Palazzo said. I disagree because there's no recognition in the penta. It's not part of the penta thing. I mean, recognition is one-on-one, right? And if people recognize you, maybe even a whole room is screaming and loving you and saying, oh my God, it's amazing. Like Mick Jagger is a projector, Prince is a projector, right? They're getting all this recognition, you could say, from the audience. It's still one-on-one. Each of those people has a personal connection to the music. They have a personal connection to the singer. I mean, it's a personal recognition. It's one at a time. So I don't think, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's a good question. I guess we're both designed to be in penta, and yet I'm perfectly happy spending 18 hours a day alone. And for many extended periods of my life, I will do that. For years, I would wake up in the morning, work all day, go at 3 or 4 o'clock, go to the cafe for 2 hours, and then walk home. And I would spend about 2 to 4 hours in Aura with other people and be completely satisfied. So there's no, like, I don't need to be in penta to be satisfied. The mechanisms of recognition and satisfaction and so on don't have to do with penta. Penta is a whole other overlay on top of it. And I think people feel just as invisible in a group, and people feel just as, how do they get wrapped up in this when they're in penta? Like, just because I have 2946 doesn't give me some special ability to be true to myself when I'm in a group, because I'm actually lending that ability to everybody. And someone else in the group might be taking us all on a trip too. I mean, yeah. So I don't know. I don't think that I mean, do you have any special feeling like when you're in groups that you feel different than other people who wouldn't have a defined G?
Yeah, you get to contribute something that's probably in a lot of cases part of your life's work. I think that if you have a penta channel, you're designed to have a penta channel, and so something that you're here to do on Earth at some point has to do with being on a team. But maybe it's only once, because again, that channel can be exercised not in a penta dynamic. But the fact that you have it's no accident. So there's at one, maybe it's just one weekend of your life, or maybe it's a longer term career in which you're participating on a team. But there's a dimension to the penta channel that only comes out in penta. So
yeah, that's true. But like what you're lending the penta technically with 731 is discipline. And what you're lending them is the ability to demonstrate that discipline. So it's in those movies, in those action movies where the villain kills one of their henchmen, That's a perfect example of 731. They're always doing it to
Mhm.
show somebody else or other people,
Mhm.
this is what we do, this is our discipline, you know. And it's such a trope, but it happens every time
Mhm.
where someone disobeys and they have to be made an example of. That's what 731 is doing in the Penta.
Mhm.
But people recognizing you for your leadership skills and recognizing you for your unique takes on what we should do in the future and your ability to guide the efficient use of resources and, you know, formulate and predict and all those things is going to be completely ignored by the Penta. That's
Right.
something that can only be appreciated in a one-on-one way.
Mhm.
Right. A comment from Ricky. She says she has felt sadness that she still doesn't do the things she used to love because she still loves them. Yes, the love does not go away. Yeah, I felt that too. It's like I love jazz piano. I haven't played it enough. I love electronic music. I haven't done enough of that. I love anime. I haven't kept up on my anime. You know, I love, it's like that is part of the sadness of the defined G, of when you love something, but it's getting cobwebs because you haven't tended to it. And just like we started this whole discussion saying how the ego needs to be tended to, needs to be massaged, needs to be nurtured, so too the G center needs to be tended to. And we can, even as defined Gs, forget what we love. And we can get stuck watching something going, why am I even watching this?
Yep.
So it does happen.
Spiritual hygiene.
Spiritual hygiene.
Everyone can practice it. Yeah.
Well, that's a good place for me to end it. If anyone has any more comments, anything at all they'd like to chime in. But I think that this was a good run. I enjoyed the ego and the G center. There's a lot deeper we can go into in those centers. And, you know, I'm putting together the curriculum for the centers class that I'm co-teaching with Mike, and he's joining for. And, you know, I set aside 10 weeks, and I think that's enough. But honestly, we could do like 3 or 4 sessions just on the ego and the G center. I mean, there's so much to go into in the centers.
We did do 7 centers last week and 2 this week.
Yeah, but the 7 we did last week, I think we could have stretched out a bit too. But yeah, I'm putting together the curriculum right now for the class. And well, we're all Signpost members, so everyone on Signpost will get free access to the class after, and also discounts if they do want to join. But since you're on Signpost, you're more than welcome to just wait for it to be uploaded. I've been working today on the Signpost streaming interface. And that's been nice. That'll be launched soon. Thanks, Ricky. She says thanks as well. Any comments on anything, Brian? I know you have both defined ego and defined G. So
I wanted to touch back on the 5125. You know, the competitive aspect of the need to be first mixed in with the innocence. So like how I relate to that through my experience is I really enjoy making a bet or being competitive with someone, as long as it's like a dollar bet, or it's like, you know, just to do it. Then I'm really into it. But if it's, you know,
if it's going to be hurtful if they lose, if they're actually going to be hurt by that, you don't want to do it.
Exactly.
And that maybe is how the G center negotiates with the ego, where the ego wants to have that that, you know, desire is kind of enlivening to it, but then the G center is saying, hey, we need to make sure that this is good for the spirit, because it could actually really hurt someone's spirit. People lose a lot of money, they get existential despair. I mean, it can really be harmful to the spirit. So it's kind of whereas if you had an undefined G, it's not to say that you wouldn't have that, it's just that there's no built-in mechanism. So you'd have to kind of learn that through trial and error of going, well, hey, you know, I used to really like to kind of being a pool shark or something, but I've learned that it actually hurts people. And so it's important for me not to do that now in a way that would hurt people. So yeah, I mean, that's really an interesting thing. It's like, yeah, being competitive, sure, but in an innocent way, in a way that has integrity.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's such an interesting point. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Just that's a good point about how the G center and the ego kind of negotiate that.
And it's not just that channel that's competitive. I think all the art channels are competitive. And to take it the way I like to take it is to the high school level, where it's like that one is like, it's not just being first, it's being special. The 3740 is being popular. The 4521 is being the boss, and the 4426 is being cool. You know, these are the ways.
Oh,
these
because
are
the
ways to teach
spleen,
teens
that
about the
way, that
art,
is
you
so
know?
good. I need to, wait, we need to do this again. The 4426 makes so much sense because the spleen is cool.
Yeah.
And so 4426 is like, makes a lot of sense. Is the cool kid.
Being savvy or being in the know.
Right.
They're-
But then 3740, they do
Popular.
want to be, and it's true, like thinking of some that we know in Santa Fe, and feeling like they're part of something and like they're
Yeah, very different kind of
recognized for
coolness, if
that.
you can even call it that. It's,
It's
more
not even-
being
yeah.
popular than it is being cool.
right. That's a good point.
And
They're
it's a
being-
little bit being sexy, being attractive. Like if that was an area of competition, you would find that more in the 3740 than any of the other art channels.
That's so interesting. And then of course, yeah, 2145 being the boss, being in
Yeah,
charge.
being macho, being deferred to, you know.
That makes a lot of sense. And then being special.
Being
That's
special,
such an
yeah.
interesting one for 5125, because the individual, the melancholy, the I'm different and you don't understand me. And there's because there can be a deep melancholy there.
Yeah, I'm
That
not
is a
only first,
melancholy.
I'm different. That's why I'm first.
Yeah. My favorite 5125 story, I had a girlfriend with that channel, Danny, and I told her I was going to New Orleans and how excited I was. And my tickets were about 8 weeks away. And she goes, I always wanted to go to New Orleans. I've always wanted to go. She went before me. She got tickets like 3 weeks ahead. And then when I got there, she's like, oh, you got to go here. This is the best jazz club. I'm like, come on. Oh, you're telling me all the places I wanted to go. And now you're just spoiling it all for me. But we had a good time. Her trip overlapped with mine a little. And it was okay. But and then I also remember I have a friend who's split definition, Kevin, and he has the 51 and bridging 25, and I have 25 and I bridge his split. And one of our favorite things together would be playing competitive video games online, where we are both competing against other people. So we're engaging in a very competitive activity, and we're trying out new things and doing things for the first time and all this stuff together. We're on that journey of like, we were playing Dark Souls was the game, but we would sit around for hours being competitive, but we're not competing with each other. We're competing with random strangers, but we had that bridging channel together, and it was such a fun time. So yeah. Lasita says she appreciated being able to just listen and hear our wisdom. So, well, thank you, Lasita. I appreciate you being here, and yeah, keep coming. We do it every Monday, and this has been really nice having Zoom. We used to do Zoom, and we kind of stopped for about a year or two, but it's nice having everyone on Zoom again. I really like it. So wonderful. Well, till next week then, everyone have a wonderful evening and great Monday, and be sure to tune in tomorrow to Mike's Surfing the Zeitgeist
In the morning.
tomorrow morning,
Yeah.
morning show, and then Mark Germain afternoon show. That's 4 hours of human design radio, basically, and we're gonna keep adding to it, is the idea anyway. I want to start doing my own radio program and start getting music on and stuff like that too, because I think it'd be nice just to have more. It's nice. I like these Zooms, but it's nice having radio because you can do stuff around the house, just kind of leave it on. So anyway, thank you all. Till next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.